My name's Cathy, and you're probably watching this video because you want to know a little bit more about the art of needle felting. So I'm here to show you the different things that you need to know, a few different techniques, just to get you started and have a better understanding of what needle felting is. So needle felting requires three different tools. The first is you need some form of felting surface. That's the surface that you're needle felting directly into. The second is you need needles. Our needles for felting are quite sharp, and they have very, very sharp points with little barbs on the edges so that as you press into the wool, it connects the wool fibers together. The third is you need wool. So what I'm going to explain to you are different kinds of wools, a little bit about the needles, and a bit about felting surfaces. If you want to know much more than this, there will be more in-depth videos. Okay, so to get started, so right now I have a foam pad. My foam pad is 2 inches thick, and this is what I would consider a medium-sized pad, which is 9 by 11. Oftentimes when I teach classes, I usually have a 6 by 6 inch by 2 inch foam pad. The reason that I like to have it so thick is that your needle is going to go in about this far. And just to be safe, if you break off the point of your needle will no longer be functional. It won't go through the wool. So you want to make sure that you protect your needle, so you definitely want to have a felting surface. Now I have a couple other felting surfaces here, one of them being a burlap sack. Now this is a small burlap sack. My large one, I used it to death, and now it's got a lot of holes in it. And this is filled with rice, so you might see this for sale, and it's perfectly fine. The burlap will eventually disintegrate. Same with the foam pad. The foam pad eventually, I call it, gets spent, where the more you stab into the foam pad, the more it will come apart. So eventually your foam pads will no longer be usable as far as felting, because little bits of black foam will show up on onto your project. Another surface I've seen are these styrofoam plastic, and I don't like stabbing into it because my needle does stick a bit. It does work fine, but I do find that these break apart probably the fastest of all the surfaces that I use. So I would recommend this is great for traveling. This one came in a kit of a class that I actually took. So again, you can use them, but I would say that if you want to invest, I would invest in something a bit firmer, like say a gray foam, the burlap. Or the last but not least is this brush. So this is a clover brush surface. You see mine's purple. That's because I did felted pansies on here. I did a lot of them, so there's a lot of wool that attached in here. I can clean that out, and I'm going to show you in a minute how to clean your surfaces. So it's just nylon bristles. I've seen people buy bristle brushes from, say, the dollar store or something like that. And what happens is when you stab into it might hit the plastic, but most likely it won't go that far. But it's really easy to felt into, and so I use this for flat felting pins and in flat surfaces like that. So those are the basics. Some people have asked me about the white foam, what you might get at the foam store. And that foam does fall apart faster than the gray foam. So if you can get a hold of the gray foam, I would recommend that over the white foam. So to clean your foam pads, once you've felted into it, I always use this is called a reversible lint brush. The brand on mine is called Helmac, but I think it's called something else now. Like it's the company made a different brand. I went online to look to see because I've had a harder time finding these, but yeah, you can find these on Amazon or in the stores. So where you would brush your surface and then you would just clean it off by just brushing the opposite. So you can probably hear it as I rub onto the pad. And that's how you would clean the lint brush. And I've had this lint brush for probably 5 years, and it's still holding up, which is really good. The other thing is that sometimes first I'll, like, so you can see this has some wool already on it, so I will pick up off the surface. I do this with the foam pad and with the burlap. And again, when you're felting, you want to make sure you're continually pulling your project up so that you don't destroy your pads. As far as the nylon, you can't really destroy this. And I have a Clover cleaning brush, and all I do is I brush it like this, and then I take the excess off. And you just keep doing that. Ooh, the table's a little wobbly. I keep doing this until it's fairly clean. I actually have two of these nylon brushes from Clover, one for light, one for dark, and I've actually labeled it dark. I can tell at this point it's dark, but that way you would cross-contaminate. So when you're felting, you don't want to cross-contaminate the fibers. So if you're working with whites and lighter colors, I would use one for that. Same with your foam pad. If you're working on a project and you've got light and dark, I would use one side for dark and one side for light. As far as a surface like this, I don't use this, so I guess the cleaning would be the same, where you could pull it up. It may not stick. Actually, the wool may not stick to this, but again, you could just pull up or use a lint brush to clean that. And this I would just recommend just pulling it up. It'll come out pretty easily from the burlap. So that's felting surfaces. Next, I'm going to talk about wool. So when you may have heard, if you've watched some videos online, or maybe you this is the first video you're watching, so thank you. So most felters, we start off with what we call core wool. And core wool, it just happens to be wool that's been washed and it's been carded, but it hasn't been refined. So like, I don't know if you could see, there's some little bits and things. So it hasn't really been picked of the vegetal matter. And I tend to buy my core wool in two different ways. The first is this is called chunky core roving. It's called roving because it has been put into this long tube-like shape. And it's nice because if you're trying to measure right, you can just measure the piece, pull it off. You could split it down the middle, and you could split it again. You could tie it into knots and things like that, right? So you have the different, right, it just comes off in the tube. Then you can get it in a batting, and this is actually merino batting, and the batting comes in sheets. So when you hear the word bat, that means it comes in sheets, and all the fibers are crisscrossed. Now, when it comes to the core roving, whether it's in bat or roving, it's all crisscrossed, which means all the fibers are crisscrossing each other, and they're going to connect a little bit easier than say wool that's not. And I'll show you in a minute the Corriedale roving that I have. You could buy roving, and any of the wools can come in roving. There's so many different types of wools that would be an entirely different video to talk about. But we use core wool as the base wool for any of the projects that I work on. Like the Phoenix here has red core wool underneath. All these projects that are behind me, they all have some form of a core wool underneath, and then I add a nice top coat color, which is where I'm going next. So this is what you might traditionally see as roving. It's quite long fibers. It's been put through a machine where it's been carded and all the fibers are going in one direction. So they're all going in one long strand. And when I say long strand, like you can still pull it apart and make the strands smaller. But this is great for spinners to spin wool into yarn. For me in projects, it works great for hair. I use it on my flying birds, and you can really do a lot of different things with that. Now, when I do felt painting, or if I want to have like a nice smooth surface or something I can blend, this is called batting. So this might be a top coat roving, and this would be like a top coat. And when I say top coat, I just mean let's see, like, so for this gnome here, the color wool on top of the white wool is what I would call a top coat. And here's a way that you could use the roving. I used that for this particular project. I'll put him back there. So when I say top coat, that's what I mean. It's the color that you would put on top of your core wool. And then last but not least, when it comes to wool types, these are locks. So when you look at a sheep, you've probably seen pictures of sheep. They are quite shaggy and bushy. And so what you want is, these are the most expensive part of the sheep. And the locks are great. I actually make sheep with these. I've made owls. I've used it as hair. There's just a lot of things that you can do with the locks. And you can, depending on the sheep breed, here's white. This would be a white border Leicester. This is a gray Lincoln. And these are actually naturally off the sheep. I've had black, I've had brown, probably see tan, you might see brown and tan. Now just a quick aside about locks. When you see the tips are yellow, that just means that they've been in the sun. So if you see gray locks with tan tips, or white locks with yellow tips, that's just the sun has dyed, basically bleached out the tips of the fibers. And you'll probably see lots of locks colored, so that means they've been dyed. And I absolutely love using those for birds and hummingbirds and different projects like that. Okay, so that's locks. Now I'm talking about needle felting. So wet felting, there's other things that you can use for wet felting, and there's many types of this roving that you could use as well. Last but not least are the needles. So the needles, I have a nice rainbow array of needles here, and my color-coded needles are with a specific company. So again, I'll be doing a needle, I'll be doing a separate video talking about the different needles, but what I have here is I have them coded, like I have them in order of what they are. So the different kinds of needles, you have a triangle needle, you've got a star needle, you've got a spiral needle, you've got reverse needles, and all the needles do different things. And a lot of people ask me, what needle do I go to the most? And I tend to use a 38 star needle and a 38 spiral needle. So with that said, I'm now going to go and talk to you a bit more, and I'll go to an overhead shot to talk more about connecting the wool fibers and the science of wool. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the wool and its scientific properties. So I hope you like science. So wool is made of very thin individual fibers. And each of these long fibers, these long threads, have scales on them. And those scales have what we say barbs or little hooks. My needle also has little barbs in it as well. All the needles have these little notches, and these notches are what connect the wool fibers to each other. So when it comes to felting, the more that I stab into my fiber, the more that those individual fibers will connect with each other. Now, this particular needle, most of the needles that you use will be intended for, as you press in, all the notches are going to connect the fibers when you press in. There are a couple exceptions to that rule, one being reverse needles. When you stab into a reverse needle and you pull back out again, it pulls the fibers out because the barbs are in a different direction. And then there's a speed point that also it actually has barbs going forward and backward, and that way you felt a bit faster, hence the name speed point. So what I do is when I work on my wool projects, I always start with some core shapes or a base. So if I'm going to create something for a figure or say an animal or something like that, I like to stack my wool fibers on top of each other. So as I'm rolling my wool, picture all these layers stacked on top of each other, so now that every time I press in to what I've stacked, all those fibers are connecting into each other. In the case of rolling, as you see, the more I roll, these edges here on the outside are starting to fray out. So if you need to keep something connected, you want it to be tighter, I would fold those edges in and I would just give a couple stabs. Be careful of your fingers. And now keep rolling. Now, if you're a beginner, it's typical for beginners to roll a little or felt a little soft. And that's okay. But the tighter that you stack these layers and stab, the firmer your piece will be. And when you get to the end, you just fold these fibers over and then you stab. I also find that I'm going to add another piece and I'm not going to stop and keep stabbing as I'm rolling it. I've been doing this for a few years, so I find that I can pretty much know the wool and the type of wool I'm using and how well it will wrap onto the shape. I also use my foam pad to help me tighten it. You can see that I'm always kind of tugging, and that is how I'm tightening up so that when I stab, the fibers, again, as they're connecting together, are going to firm up. Now, the particular wool that I'm using on this is Dorset. And Dorset will felt differently than say merino or Romney or any of the other wools. So when you get into felting, you'll play around more with the different types of wools, and that will most likely be another video at some time. Okay. Now I have a couple tools that I like to use when I'm needle felting. They're both from the company Clover, and this particular tool, this is called a 3-needle pen tool. And the pen tool will help me felt 3 times faster because it has 3 needles. So what you very carefully, I will stab into my wool shape and it will help me felt 3 times faster. And this is great if you do a lot of felting. This will save you time and it'll help you firm up your pieces more. This is a 5-needle punch tool, and you can use this on your 3D felted pieces, but I tend to use it more when I'm creating a flat shape. So if I were to create like an ear or a wing or something, right, I would be stabbing a bit more flat, and I tend to use the punch tool for that. Now, if I were to create, say, like this could be a large mouse ear or something like that, I use my single needle to control the fibers to make sure that they don't flatten out too much and that it's not fuzzy on the ends, and then I'll alternate it with the punch tool. So you can use it with most of your projects. Personally, I tend to use the pen tool for most everything that's three-dimensional. Now, if you want to attach, say this is the body and this is the very giant head. If you want to attach this piece to this piece, you need to have some loose ends on this piece. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a little blanket that I'm going to lay this piece on. I call it a blanket because that's what it reminds me of. So I put my piece on one side, I flip it over. Basically what you want to make sure is that you have a loose end on your piece that you want to attach to the other piece. So again, with the science of wool, you want to get all these little individual fibers to connect into the fibers that are in this piece, the piece that you're connecting it to. So I'm gonna, the more that you have, like I was gonna say I'm gonna spread it, but if you want to, you can spread the fibers, but if you want to, say you're going to be creating something that you don't want to see the pieces, I do a little sweep and tuck as I stab these fibers into the shape, right? So I'm making a nice solid edge here. If you're not concerned about that, say you're going to be adding a top coat or you're going to be adding locks on there, then you could just spread these fibers out and have them connect to your shape. So it's all dependent on what you do, but the bottom line is that you want to make sure that these fibers are connecting into this piece so it doesn't fall apart. You can see I would work a lot more on this, but for demonstration purposes, you can see how it's connected. I am actually tugging pretty hard on this. Now, if you want to attach a flat shape, see how I'm leaving the ends loose again, you would be stabbing those loose fibers into your main shape, and that's how these pieces connect to each other. I don't know what I'm creating here, but it's pretty odd, isn't it? Okay, so now if you want to add oh wait, before I do that, I wanted to show you another way that I stack the fibers together is I use a skewer. So if you have trouble wrapping on your pad and you feel like, or say that you have a hard time doing that, I find that if you wrap your shape on a skewer and you hold your fibers very close, right? You don't want to, if you pull too far, it'll pull it off. So if you keep it close, you can use the skewer and you can see that I'm getting a really tight wrap. And this is a way that you can get your product, your project to firm up. Right. And I used like you could see how tight it got. I didn't even really need to wrap, like I didn't need to stab it much when it was on the skewer. If it's too soft and you want to make sure, just make sure that you give it a few stabs on the skewer and then stab the top and bottom. But that's just another way that you can wrap, and it really, it's really, it's been felted pretty tightly there. So, okay. So now if you want to add a top coat color, so I'm going to start off, this is batting. And what I do is you don't want to get it too thick necessarily. So I always create a thinner piece, and then and if I need to add more, so see how I lay it on there? I like, you don't want to make your head too big or your piece much larger. So I would take one thin piece, hold it on there, realize I probably need a bit more, and then I'll just add another piece on there. So always be conscious when you're adding a top coat on how much you're using. So what I'm doing now is I'm tacking, by stabbing my needle, the fibers from this color into the fibers of the pieces that I want it to be in. Now, usually I'll use a finer needle. I'll be talking about needles in a different video, but you can see some of the holes. The tighter that you hold your top coat to your shape, the less holes you'll see, but it could also mean that your piece might be too firm, or sorry, too soft, or that you need a finer needle. And you could also use one of these tools when you're attaching that. So one thing I do want to show you is, I'm just going to pull this apart a little bit. So one of the things you need to be concerned with is if I lay all this color on top here and I stab a lot on here, right? So I'm just kind of really stabbing. I want to show you about cross-contaminating your fibers. So see how all these brown fibers came through. And if you wanted this piece to remain white, you have to be careful about how deep that you stab into your wool fiber. You could always add a little bit more white to cover that. And again, if you gently stab, some of the white will come through the other side. And so you know what, you work with what you have. You just kind of keep going back and forth. This is a really thin piece. If this piece was a lot thicker, like I'll show you, if I really stab into this, it doesn't come through quite as much, but you can still see it came through the other side. That's just something to be conscious of when you're working. The other type of wool is roving. And roving is the wool that it gets all in one direction. So sometimes if I pull it off the roving, like on my rope, I find that it might be too long. So I hand card to shorten those fibers. And then when I go to add it onto the shape, what you might find with roving is that you'll see that linear when you're stabbing on. So if you're trying to blend parts in to other parts, you might see all those little line fibers. My recommendation is to spread them apart as much as you can so that you don't see that where the edging is of the roving. Or I typically use batting when I'm trying to blend colors together. I tend to use roving for more of a for hair and wings and things like that. But that's just a way you add top coat onto your pieces. Obviously, I would be working a lot more on that, but for demo purposes, I will just leave that alone. So that's pretty much the basics of felting a three-dimensional object. If you wanted to do a felt painting, so a needle felt painting is when you take your wool and you stab it with your needles into a felt sheet. And this particular felt sheet is 100% wool. This looks familiar. You've probably seen this in craft stores. And so this is actually 100% wool. The stuff at the craft stores is acrylic. So the acrylic wool, it's not wool, sorry. It's just a felted sheet. I find that the holes are a little bit larger. The wool doesn't quite connect quite the same to it. And just like with paint, like any kind of, like if you're a painter with paints, you'll probably buy a better canvas if you want to have a long-lasting piece. So I recommend using wool. And so what happens is, to get it to look like this, you can see the wool has come through on the back side, right? So what's happening is all our little fibers of the color wool are connecting into the felt sheet. So I lay my color down, and every time I stab into the color wool, into the felt sheet, these fibers are now connecting with the felt sheet. So you can see how it's coming through. The nice thing about felt, I love felt painting. I tend to use batting with felt painting. You can use roving. If you're going to use roving, I would have a pair of scissors so that you could shorten, like if you're going to be doing a lot with it, or you could just hand card it. Like I just pulled a bunch out. And again, with the roving, the fibers are longer typically. So what I do is you want to give it probably a few more stabs in the middle, and you can see it coming through. So you definitely want to shorten those up so you can either cut pieces off to felt in, or you could pull them apart with your hand. And now once the wool is on, right, so you could see this one has a lot of wool connected. When I go to attach a piece like this, or if I want to add, we'll just add a little bit of this brown. I'll just stab a little bit right up here. When you want to add another color on top, it's going to connect even better because you already have wool and the felt sheet now, right, underneath, and you can see that those colors coming through. And the nice thing is if you make a mistake, you could just pull it out, right? So I didn't ruin my picture at all. I can continue working on my little scene. So that's pretty much the basics of wool connecting with wool and the science of how that all happens. So I want to thank you for watching this video. If you have any questions about anything that I talked about, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will show up at the end of this video, as well as I'll have it in the comments area. Thank you.